They're not happy with Kathleen Wynne and the Liberals. I mean, she's always picking fights with the Auditor General. Mr. Ford is not giving us the straight good. We are going to ask the richest Ontarians and the richest corporations to pay a little bit more. 42% of young people are going to be leaving Toronto because they can't afford to live here.
Ontario is at a political crossroads and one of the most important election campaigns of the past 50 years. Everyone at this moment is talking about NDP leader Andrea Horwath and the M word, momentum. Andrea, welcome, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
One of the first things we want to chat about is momentum. The polls show that there's been a nice uptick to the point now that the NDP is a real threat to form the next government. What do you think is happening?
I don't call it a threat. I call it an opportunity.
There we go.
You know, it's interesting. We are finding that our campaigns are letting us know that there's a sense of excitement on the ground. 1 week in, while we're having this conversation, 3 weeks to go. So there's a lot that can happen. But we're excited about showing the people of Ontario that they don't have to keep going back and forth between Liberals and Conservatives, that they can choose something different this time around, a party that's going to put people at the heart of every decision government makes.
Your election platform is titled About Change. One of the things that I think people are trying to struggle with is what's the difference between your campaign, the NDP, and the Liberals?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, and I think one of the things that's become clear is that people do want change because they're not happy with Kathleen Wynne and the Liberals. They're telling me they're extremely disappointed with the Liberals and with Kathleen Wynne in particular, and they're looking for some kind of change this time around. And I can say for sure, we will not be cutting hospitals, for example. We're going to fix the hallway medicine problem that the Liberals have created. We're not interested in selling off our public assets like hydro, nor do we want the bills to continue to go up. In fact, the Ford and Wynne plan is exactly that. Bills will go up by 70% under that plan. And well, these two our hydro bills are going through the roof. Well, we're going to do something completely different, get people's bills down permanently and bring that utility back so that it's there for the next generation to benefit from. So there are many, many differences between what New Democrats have in mind versus the disappointment that people have had with the Liberals and the reality that, you know, after 2 decades or more with Conservatives and Liberals, families have still felt that they're not getting ahead, that they're feeling squeezed, and we believe that we can change that up. This is the problem with Ontario right now, folks.
You don't understand.
This is the problem. You don't understand how healthcare works.
So you also plan to run deficits for the next 5 years. When will you balance the budget?
Well, our plan does certainly invest in some of the things that we believe will help families to do better. You know, we have had a growth in our economy the last number of years, but everyday families don't seem to be getting the benefit of that growth. And so what we want to do is make life easier and better for everyday families. So those investments are going to mean deficits for the first 3 years going upwards. But year 4 and year 5, we start to come down. I think year 5, our deficit projection is $1.9 billion. And then we'll be heading down to balance within the next couple of years from there. So we do have a track for going to balance, but our top priority is helping families balance their budgets.
So I'm wondering if you can help me understand the discrepancy between what the FAO, the financial officer, is saying about the projected spending by the current government, which is not dissimilar from your projected spending, and the need to reduce spending by $15 billion or 8% by 2024 in order to reach that future balanced budget state.
Well, I mean, I think the biggest difference is that, unlike Kathleen Wynne and the Liberals, we are showing in our fiscal plan how we're going to pay for some of the changes that we're prepared to make, how we're going to pay for things like dental care, how we're going to pay for pharmacare for everyone, no matter how old you are, how we're going to make sure that families can afford childcare, and we are going to ask the richest Ontarians and the richest corporations to pay a little bit more to help us to achieve these goals for everyday families. And so if you're earning over $220,000 a year, you're going to see a 1% increase in your tax. If you're earning over $300,000 as an individual, so not a combined family income, individual income, you're going to see a 2% increase, a 2-point increase in your taxes. And we are going to take the corporate tax rate and begin to bring it back to close to where it was when the Liberals started cutting it. We're not going to go all the way up to the 14%, but in year 2 and year 3, we're going to increase the tax on the corporations that are doing well. And as you know, that doesn't affect companies that are struggling or having a hard time. This is tax on profits, which is what we're prepared to do to to try to help everyday folks participate more in the economy.
So if you talk to certainly some economists, Ontario already has the second highest tax rate for high-income earners. These are the type of people, doctors and entrepreneurs, who, when you put the taxes up too high, they don't come to the province. Ontario is already struggling with, in terms of investment from the business sector. We've had flat wage growth for much of the past decade. A lot of these things can be tied, arguably, to economic policies that embrace the tax the rich, tax the corporations philosophy. You seem to be heading down that same road.
Well, I mean, I would have to disagree insofar as, in fact, on the corporate tax side, it's been the opposite. I mean, the Liberals have been cutting corporate taxes. They were 14% when the Liberals took office. Those taxes have come down. We didn't see the wage growth as a result of that, and we didn't see the increase in investment, in productivity investment of any kind. And so the very policies that that are sometimes touted as the ones that create that wage growth or that create that productivity investment haven't occurred as a result of reduction of corporate taxes.
Your assertions about Doug Ford and his spending cuts, as I understand it, he's planning to cut spending by 4%, $6 billion. He plans to run a deficit in the first couple of years of his mandate and won't spend less than the current $150 billion that the government is spending. He won't fire a single government worker, he says. Doesn't sound unreasonable, dangerous, or like slashing. So what are you basing your criticism on that he's going to make these wholesale cuts?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I wish Mr. Ford would be straight up and honest with people about exactly what his cuts look like. I mean, when we had Mr. Harris as the potential premier of the province, he was pretty straight up about what his intentions were. We had Mr. Hudak, and he was honest about what his cuts were going to look like. Mr. Ford is not giving us the straight goods, and I would ask him to at least to have the guts to do what his predecessor leaders have done and show people the actual plan. We hear bits and pieces dropped here and there, but as a businessman, Mr. Ford wouldn't, I don't think, sign a contract without knowing what's in it. I don't think Mr. Ford would, make an order from a supplier without knowing what he was buying. Same deal here. He needs to tell Ontarians exactly what his cuts look like. Because, $6 billion, when you know that much of government spending is salaries and wages, it's really hard to imagine a $6 billion cut without affecting any jobs, without affecting things like our healthcare system, without affecting our education system, the very things that families rely upon. And so I would just ask Mr. Ford, to be straight up and honest with folks so they can get a sense of what it is that he intends on doing.
But aren't you planning at some point to balance the budget, and won't that mean necessarily some constraint? Most of what government spends is salary. If you're to balance the budget, at some point you need to introduce a measure of constraint. Surely not everything in government, the way it's managed right now, surely not everything is as efficient as it could be. Surely not every program is necessary. Do you not see that as possible, or acknowledge that it's possible to find savings without making cuts that are as harmful as you suggest they might be?
Oh, well, I mean, on the contrary, I look very carefully every single year at the Auditor General's reports, and we know very well that the Liberals have made some pretty big mistakes that have helped their friends do well, but have you know, have squandered the public dollar, and we will look to the Auditor General and the Financial Accountability Officer to help us tighten those things up. That's the obligation any government should have if they're being careful with the public dollar. And why do you want to be careful with the public dollar? Because it should be going into public services and not into private interests. And you know, this is something that I'm quite concerned about when we see the Premier of our province that's now running for re-election basically argue with those independent officers on a regular basis. I mean, she's always picking fights with the Auditor General, denying that those numbers are in fact the case or truthful. She hires her own outside accounting firms to try to refute the Auditor General's analysis, and yet the Auditor General works for you and I and every other Ontarian. The Auditor General doesn't have a political or partisan bent or bias. Her job is to you know, work out the numbers on behalf of the people. But Mr. Ford, he said he's going to hire his own auditors to audit the audits that are happening at Queen's Park. I think all of that is a waste of time and money. We have independent officers that work on behalf of the Ontario people, and we need to take those folks seriously and take their advice, more importantly.
I'm glad you brought up Mike Harris. I wanted to bring up Bob Rae, and not necessarily in a negative way. Floyd Logren was perhaps the most honest and one of the best finance ministers this province has ever seen. Both he and Mr. Rae were forced to make substantial cuts to government services in their time. In fairness, the economy wasn't the best. But they cut thousands of jobs. They cut public programs that affected everything from hospitals to libraries. They cut hospital beds. And it was done because when you're in government, you're faced with those tough choices. Why was it wrong or right for Mr. Rae and Mr. Logren to make those type of tough choices, but wrong for Ford or any premier to make choices like that?
Well, again, I guess what I would say is that certainly it's not 1990 right now, and although we had a small recession in the 2008-9 period, but prior to that, so from 95 to that point, and then since that recession recovery occurred, you know, the economy has done well, the GDP has grown, you know, people at the top continue to do well, but everyday families are having a tough time. I mean, young people, Board of Trade has said, 42% of young people are going to be leaving Toronto because they can't afford to live here.
This has become about your developer friends or Ms. Wynn's developer friends. I think the question was about affordable housing for young people across the GTA.
They can't afford the rent. They can't buy a house. There's no hope that they can even buy a house in the neighborhood that they were raised in. They can't afford childcare, so they're leaving. Well, those are the exact kind of people that we need in this city to continue to call it and grow it as a world-class city. So our plan says that, you know, we need to change things up for those folks. We need to change things up for everyday families, and the bulk of the you know, the prosperity of this province has gone to the very few. We need to make sure that we're sharing that prosperity so that people have a chance to build a good life in our province. And I said this off the top, and I really do believe it. We have had over 2 decades of Conservative and Liberal governments. Most of the time, things have been going well economically. And as you mentioned, you know, that's not been reflected in increased wages. In fact, our province, as you know, nationwide, was the worst in terms of wage growth of all of the provinces of our country, and yet Ontario is the most prosperous of all provinces. There's something out of whack, and the way that we put that back into balance, if you will, back into a fair society, is by asking those people who have benefited the most from this growth and this wealth creation to pitch in a little bit more to help everybody else get some hope for the future. Because the way things are now, I hear parents extremely worried about lack of opportunity for their adult children who are leaving university and college with huge debt and few opportunities. Real concern about young families who are deciding not to have a second child because they simply can't afford it. And again, as I mentioned, young people leaving the city of Toronto because they have no hope of being able to afford to live here. These are real concerns that we need to address, and that it's government's responsibility to address.
A couple of quick questions just before we wrap up. You've ruled out a coalition with the Liberals. How do you avoid that if you find yourself in a situation where the Liberals and the NDP have enough seats to form a government, what justification in that case is there to permit the Conservatives to rule?
Well, I mean, I'm going to give the people of the province the respect of making their decision first. Yep. That's something that's coming on June 7th. As I've said before,
I am running to be your next premier.
I'm in this to form a government because I believe that we are the only party that is offering real hope for everyday families and a chance to do something completely different this time around.
We live in a great province where everyone should be able to build a great life. But for too long, the people of Ontario have been told to settle, to switch back and forth from the Conservatives to the Liberals and back again. And just look where it's gotten us. It's no wonder that folks are cynical about politics. I'm offering something completely different.
Not go back to the same old choices, go from bad to worse, from Liberals to Conservatives, and everyday families will continue to feel the squeeze. So I'm encouraging folks, do something different this time and vote for change for the better.
Well, there are 3 weeks left in this campaign. That's a lifetime in politics. It will be an exciting finish, no doubt. Andrea, good luck, and thank you very much for joining us.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.